My name is Maria Angeles, and I'm from the state of Durango, although I emigrated with my parents to the United States when I was a teenager. Well, once I was here, it was hard to adapt, and I started making a lot of mistakes that derailed my life for quite a while. Fortunately, I've changed my lifestyle, but when I was 19, around 2015, I ended up in jail for 3 months after getting into a fight with the sister of a so-called friend I was living with at the time. The charges weren't too serious, and the lawyer assigned to me said that if I behaved myself, I could get out even sooner. He told me to participate in the workshops, keep my head down, and not get into trouble with anyone. And to be honest, that's exactly what I did. In the end, they sent me to the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. And that's where I began to learn my lesson, because what I saw daily in that prison was simply horrifying. The prison was a disaster, and the guards there were abusive, rude, and some had a terrifying look. However, that's another story. What I'm about to tell you, of a more paranormal nature, has nothing to do with the guards or the negative energy that permeated that prison, but rather with the woman who was my cellmate for 4 months, whom I will call Zoe. The description I'm about to give is not intended to offend her or anything of the sort, and I want to emphasize that I wasn't in the best place in my life at that time either, but Zoe was in a terrible state. She was a 30-year-old drug addict, although her skin, face, and blonde hair made her look 60. She was addicted to methamphetamine and had enormous dark circles under her eyes that showed she hadn't slept for days, maybe even weeks. When they took me to the cell, she was sleeping, or rather trying to sleep, in the bed under the bunk. I arranged my few things on the top bunk, but I couldn't even get in before she whispered to me, "Can you see them?" I obviously didn't know what she was talking about and just shook my head while whispering that I didn't know. Then she persisted as she got out of bed. "You can see my children. I'm looking for them. I want to talk to them. Explain to them that it wasn't my fault, but I don't know where they are. Can you see them?" I was completely out of touch with reality, and considering that I was experimenting with drugs at the time, I was deeply affected by that woman's mental state. I saw myself reflected in her and felt a lot afraid of, because I was the person I would be sleeping with for the next few months. I asked her to calm down, but she didn't listen. And for the next 10 minutes, she kept asking me where her children were, until I left the cell. In the common area, I sat at a table near the phones and was alone for a short time. 5 minutes later, a slightly plump older woman, around 60 years old, approached me with a smile on her face. Her name was Magdalena, and she welcomed me. She explained how things worked and who I should be wary of. For the next few months, she would be my support, and I struggled to understand how such a sweet person had ended up in such a horrible place. After talking for a while, I felt comfortable enough to ask her if she knew what was wrong with my cellmate. Magdalena became a little more serious before warning me that Zoe was somewhat unstable and that I should be careful around her. That was undoubtedly the worst thing she could have said, because when the guards ordered us back to our cells and I saw her there, talking to herself, I felt very unsafe. I tried to greet her, but she completely ignored me, and for the next few hours she paid no attention to me, just talking to the walls. I paid attention to her, and although she spoke English with a very strange accent, I managed to understand some things, like, "Please understand that I didn't want to leave, and I beg you, please stop." Seeing her was heartbreaking, and little by little, as the days passed, fear gave way to pity. It was clear that this woman needed psychiatric help, and that regardless of what she had done, they should have sent her to a mental institution. When the lights went out on the first day, she backed away to her bed, and I heard her finally whisper, "Tonight, just tonight, please. Mommy needs to sleep." Those words made me feel very strange, because I understood somehow that this woman was talking to her children, or rather, she was trying to. I felt sorry for her, and although I wanted to stay alert, I gradually fell asleep from how long I had been awake. Suddenly, I wasn't sure if I'd been dreaming like that all along. I realized that the laughter wasn't part of my dream, but she wasn't even awake. She was still crying in the fetal position. When I spoke to her, she didn't even move. I felt my heart race at that moment because, even though I couldn't see them, I could feel someone staring at me. It was like a weight on my shoulders, and I understood that it was best not to get involved. I slowly made my way back to my bed, turned over, and tried to go back to sleep. Obviously, I don't know what time it was, But judging by how quiet the cell block was, I suppose it was well into the early hours of the morning. There was nothing to be heard except for some distant snores and the sudden laughter of a child. I thought it was part of my dream and didn't pay any attention to it, although those laughs were repeated a couple of times. What really woke me up were some whimpers accompanied by a faint but distinct smell of smoke. I opened my eyes and the cell was completely dark. And I'm downstairs. She was crying and moving from side to side. She kept whispering apologies over and over. I was half asleep and half awake, and I stayed as still as a statue while I carefully sniffed around. And yes, I smelled smoke in the cell. I got really scared because I thought the prison might be on fire, and I jumped out of my bunk to look out the window and the door. As soon as I did this, the smell disappeared, but not before the laughter of some children echoed behind me. I immediately turned to Zoe, thinking that maybe she was the one who had done it, but barely 5 minutes had passed. I heard something again inside the cell, very faint, like the sound of a bare foot on the floor. I thought Zoe had gotten up, but that wasn't possible, since I could hear her squealing under my bed. And although I didn't hear any more laughter, that smell of smoke returned. That night was very difficult, and although I don't know how I managed to fall asleep after that, when I woke up, I didn't feel quite right. I had a cough all morning and felt fatigued. Zoe, meanwhile, was already awake, pacing in circles around the cell, which wasn't very big, it should be noted. I asked her if she was going out, but she didn't answer. A while later, I rejoined Magdalena. She introduced me to a group of women, and I got along well with all of them. Eventually, the topic of why we were there came up, and I discovered that Magdalena had poisoned her husband, that some had committed fraud and theft, and one of them was there for vandalizing a car. Suddenly, curiosity got the better of me when I saw Zoe leave her cell to eat, and I whispered to them, asking if they knew why Zoe was there. Some looked at each other, and others lowered their heads, but Magdalena remained firm and, before answering, asked me why I wanted to know. That question surprised me a little, and after thinking for a few seconds, I told them what I had experienced that night. I didn't want to seem ridiculous because I know many people don't believe in ghosts or spirits, but luckily none of them mocked me or thought I was crazy. In fact, some of them, my cellmates, slowly began to feel something. When I finished, they confirmed that they too had noticed a strange smell of smoke and burnt fabric since they arrived, but that when they mentioned it to the guards, they were ridiculed and dismissed. At that moment, Magdalena nodded gently and confessed to me that Zoe was there because of the wrongful death of her 2 children in a fire caused by her negligence. She didn't know all the details, of course, but she understood that Zoe's addiction had led her to it. Her children were already in a very precarious situation, and when the electricity was cut off, she had the fateful idea of cooking with firewood near the window, inside an abandoned house she was occupying. The children were in one of the rooms, and when the fire got out of control, she panicked and ran out of the house, forgetting about the little ones. When she wanted to go back, it was too late. The flames engulfed the entire structure, and the children died of asphyxiation. It is unknown whether Zoe did it on purpose or if it was a terrible accident. Only she knows. But she was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Of all the inmates, Magdalena was the only one present when Zoe was brought in, and she assured us that Zoe wasn't like that. Yes, she was a bit erratic due to her drug addiction, but that deplorable state she was in was the result of something else. Perhaps her conscience was making her pay, or something more. With the new information, things were very different that night. Again, Zoe, her voice weary, spoke to the walls, pleading for a moment of rest. As soon as the lights went out, I fell asleep, only to be awakened again by the smell of smoke and the playful laughter of children who had left this world many years before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, because now I understood what was happening, and although she was entirely to blame, I felt sorry for Zoe, who was begging for forgiveness as she tossed and turned in her bed. I kept my eyes closed for fear of seeing something I shouldn't, and for several hours that smell and those intermittent laughs repeated themselves, preventing her from resting. The many times I tried to communicate with Zoe, she simply ignored me or asked if I could see them, and I didn't know whether to answer or not, as I had no idea what reaction it might provoke. But one morning, 2 weeks after I arrived, I sat down with her and told her that I could smell them and hear them. A smile spread across Zoe's face, and she began to cry, assuring me that she thought she had gone mad. I tried to advise her to go to the chapel, but she told me it was pointless. For more than 3 months, this happened every night without fail. In the morning, I would spend some time comforting Zoe and talking with her. They were erratic conversations, and I felt sorry for her because I wasn't the right person to help her. I tried to get her help from the prison authorities, but as I said at the beginning, that prison was terrible and riddled with corruption. No one offered Zoe a helping hand, and one night, those events escalated. I figured it was September 3rd or maybe 4th, and the night, as always, was quiet in the cell block. I slept peacefully, at least those first few hours before the phenomena started again. It all began after 1 a.m. I did the math, so there was a window of time after 9 p.m. when I could rest. However, that night, instead of a strong smell of burning wood, what woke me up was a bang on the bunk bed that shook my bed and made it unsound. I got up almost instinctively and did something I hadn't done since the first day: opened my eyes. Despite the darkness, my accustomed eyes could make out 2 silhouettes standing by the toilet, small silhouettes of children staring in our direction. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze as I watched them approach and stop in front of the bunk. I couldn't see their features, but somehow I knew they weren't looking at me. It was Zoe who was sobbing and begging for forgiveness over and over again. I obviously couldn't do anything, and when I finally mustered the willpower, I grabbed my sheet and covered myself with it, trembling with fear as I listened to their whispers. I didn't quite understand what they were saying, but I think they were reproaching her for leaving them inside the house, for abandoning them. That night was, without a doubt, the most terrifying of my life. And unlike other nights, those specters didn't leave until the sun came up. I didn't open my eyes once, and I'm sure Zoe didn't either. In the morning, Zoe confessed to me that it was the anniversary of her baby's deaths and started crying again. From then on, things went back to normal until my lawyer visited me to tell me that my sentence had been reduced for good behavior and that I would be out in a week. They threw me a small party to celebrate my release, and even Zoe was genuinely happy for me, snapping out of her usual days to give me a hug and thank me for my help, even though I hadn't actually done anything. I left prison, did community service, and they helped me find a job. I dedicated myself to fixing my life, got clean, and cut ties with all my so-called friends. I reconnected with my family, and now, 10 years later, I can honestly say that I am a better person and that I will never make the same mistakes again. Regarding that horrible correctional facility, I believe it was closed in 2024 due to a class action lawsuit because of all the abuses that went on there, and I couldn't be happier, even though I wasn't a direct victim. I did hear and see more than I want to talk about, and as for Zoe, I don't know what to say. Her crimes are truly serious, and I don't know if she deserves her children's forgiveness or not. I only know that I saw a very different side of her, one of genuine remorse, and I hope she spends the last years of her sentence in a prison where she will receive help, though I'm certain of one thing. The spirits of those little ones still haunt her, and only God knows how long this will continue. Good evening. My name is Oscar, and I am a security guard at a prison in Andalusia, Spain. I have been a follower of this channel for several years, and I believe that this story I am about to tell you, while not the most terrifying, certainly fits the theme of this channel. Although I must clarify immediately that I will not say where it takes place, as I still work at this institution. I started working as a guard in security around 2018 with the help of a friend who recommended me for the job. I was a police officer for several years before, but an injury prevented me from continuing on the force. I have to tell you that being an officer and being a prison guard are very different and equally dangerous jobs. It's not easy to watch over the inmates because, while there are some prisoners who are good people who have made mistakes, there are also others who are truly dangerous and are always plotting something. That's why, at my age, it was better and more peaceful for me to be sent to watch the yard from the guard tower. They gave me a rifle equipped with rubber bullets. My job was to shoot any inmate who dared to climb the wall or the perimeter fence or who was in the yard at night. I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but it has happened on occasion that criminals have managed to escape from the thick walls of a prison by breaching all the defenses and escaping right under the guards' noses. That's why my job, although not the most active within the prison, is equally important. The first day I was assigned to a tower, my boss told me to stay calm and please not to open fire without a good reason. And then he gave me a warning that seemed very strange to me at the time. Please, on the night shift, if you see something in the yard, wait a few seconds. Try shining your light on it and wait for it to disappear. Only shoot if you see it run toward the fence. I was new to the job, and the tone in which he told me was very serious, so I didn't dare contradict him or ask if he was joking. But it was impossible not to think that this order was some kind of hazing ritual, and that at night some colleague would come out into the yard to play a prank on me. However, that didn't happen, and nothing interesting occurred during the following weeks. My shifts rotated, so sometimes I had to watch the yard from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., and other times from 8 p.m. until dawn. The yard was never completely empty, as different groups of inmates came out from the various cell blocks every hour, so I wasn't bored. However, the hours dragged by at night. I suppose it was about a month after I started working there that I began to notice him. It was a typical summer day. It was very hot, and I was scanning the yard, watching the inmates for any suspicious activity, like arms or drug trafficking. If I saw anything, I would have to radio them in so they could be apprehended. While I was doing this, my gaze fell upon someone in particular, a young white man with black hair. He was wearing the orange uniform of the other inmates, and yet he seemed different as he kept to himself, pressed against a concrete wall in the shade. This was strange because, to give you an idea, in this prison, the inmates spent almost their entire day inside their cells or working and only had an hour in the yard each day. I witnessed daily how they ran around trying to get at least a little sun, but he, however, remained still like a statue in the shade, staring back at me. I didn't think much of it and simply kept an eye on him every now and then to make sure he wasn't dealing drugs or doing anything strange. What surprised me was that an hour later, when a new group of inmates arrived, I saw him again in a different part of the yard. I warned my colleagues that an inmate from the previous block had stayed behind in the yard, but as soon as I tried to tell them where he was, he vanished from my sight. No matter how much we looked for him, he had simply vanished. During my break, I assured my colleagues that I hadn't made a mistake and that I was sure it was the same inmate. Almost all of them told me not to worry about it, that I had probably misread something and that it could happen to anyone. Only one of them, a few minutes before we left to go back to work, said to me in a low voice, "I believe you because I've seen him once or twice, but he always disappears. I don't know how or why, but remember that this place must accumulate a lot of bad energy, and over the years many people must have died here. I advise you not to give it so much importance." That colleague had been working there for several years, so it made me feel better that he had also seen him. That's why I didn't think he was crazy when, a few days later, I saw him again in different parts of the yard, at different times of the day, blending in with the other inmates and always looking up at the towers, as if he were looking for someone. I didn't dare call my colleagues because even though I tried my best not to take my eyes off him, I would lose sight of him after a few seconds, as if he were moving like a shadow behind the other prisoners. It was impossible to keep up with him before he disappeared. This didn't happen every week, but when it did, it gave me goosebumps. I couldn't explain where this guy came from or how he moved so fast. I told all this to my wife, and she's very spiritual. She said that maybe he was a lost soul, invisible to the others. For my part, I don't know what other explanation to give her. I would have preferred to give her a logical explanation. But shortly after completing my first year into my job, something happened that confirmed I was witnessing a supernatural event. It was midnight, and I was in one of the guard towers overlooking the yard. I was observing the walls and the apparent blind spots that I assumed an inmate outside his cell could exploit. However, it's a job that can become tiring and monotonous very quickly. My vision began to blur, and to avoid falling asleep, I sat down for a minute and grabbed my coffee thermos to pour myself a cup. The lights, however, continued to move automatically, scanning every section of the yard, waiting for the antiquated motion sensors to be triggered by someone's footsteps. I only relaxed for about 20 seconds. While I was warming my hands with a cup of coffee, when I stood up again, I saw him standing in the middle of the courtyard staring at my tower. A chill ran down my spine, and I admit I even lost my balance from the shock of seeing him. I raised my rifle and aimed it, thinking he was an inmate who had escaped from his cell, but something told me not to pull the trigger. The motion sensors didn't activate, and the lights continued their normal path, scanning the courtyard. Sooner rather than later, the light would illuminate him, and I radioed my partner in the opposite tower to ask him to confirm that he saw him too. He said yes. At that moment, I seriously considered whether or not to call the command center, but then I remembered the warning my boss had given me a year earlier when I started the job, that if I didn't run to the perimeter fence, I should just let it go. I kept my cool, glancing back at him but without lowering my rifle, and he stayed there for a couple of seconds. Even though it was dark, I knew it was that boy, white, thin, and with black hair. The anticipation of the light approaching him was killing me, and I started to tremble. So much so that I knew if he ran toward the fence, there was no way I could hit him. But finally, the spotlight shone on him, and as if he became one with the light, he vanished before my eyes. I called my coworker, and he confirmed that he had also seen him disappear and assured me that I shouldn't worry about it. It's funny that he asked me that because I was truly terrified. I had to sit for 5 minutes until I managed to control the trembling in my hands, and all night I was afraid he would reappear. Years have passed, and I haven't found an explanation for what my coworker and I sometimes see in the courtyard. No photos come out, and no one else seems to see it the way we do. My boss hasn't given me any explanation, and I can only speculate that at some point that young man died in that courtyard, the victim of a gunshot from one of the towers. That's why he stares at the towers, frozen in time. I haven't stopped watching him, and although I've gotten used to it, I can't help but feel a sharp, almost painful chill down my spine when I catch him looking toward my tower. Hello, community. My name is Camilo, and I'm from Guanajuato. This isn't really my story, but my dad Carlos's. For years, he worked as a security guard at a state penitentiary, and I asked his permission to share it here. He's happy for me to share it with you, as long as I don't mention the real names of his co-workers or the institution where these events took place. First, a little context. It was 1991, and my dad was desperately looking for work. He had just married my mom, and they were paying rent on a small apartment in a very humble neighborhood. My dad had lost his job and his construction work was barely enough, and my mom's work alone wasn't enough to make ends meet. Knowing his dire situation, an old friend of my dad's met with him and told him that his brother worked for the Guanajuato Prison Department and that there were openings for prison guards. My dad is, and always has been, a very easygoing guy, so he found that information both funny and absurd. Him having to subdue and intimidate prisoners to keep them in line? That was impossible. But his friend explained that no, he wouldn't have to talk to or fight any of the inmates. He would only have to monitor them through the security cameras. And he ended up giving him a chance. He got the job immediately on the night shift in a control room position. In addition to activating and deactivating the new electronic locks, he also had to monitor the security cameras throughout the prison. If any inmate was outside their cell or if there was an obvious violation of the rules, he had to notify the other guards to act accordingly. At first, it was an extremely boring job, making sure the empty, dark prison corridors remained empty. The only movement often seen was that of the security guards, who walked slowly through the corridors doing the midnight head count to ensure the inmates were still asleep in their cells. After that, and until 6 a.m., there was no movement on the security cameras, except on a couple of occasions when things were radically different. That job brought financial stability to the house, and my dad adapted to the work quite quickly. Because of the stress of working with convicts, his colleagues made an effort to stick together, and there was a sense of camaraderie among the other guards. In fact, he made a great friend there, whom I'll call Hector. Mr. Hector was a bit older, maybe around 60, and close to retirement. He always told my father, "I don't know what I'm going to do when I retire, Carlos. I'm going to be bored at home." My father always replied that he had to find something quieter to do and recommended pottery or crafts. He just laughed. They threw him a farewell party when he retired around 95. Nobody would have thought that Mr. Hector would be diagnosed with cancer a year after retiring and that he would die a few months later. Life can be truly unfair sometimes. Time passed, and one August night like any other, my dad was sitting in his usual spot in the control room with his colleague, whom I'll call Octavio. It was 11:30 at night, as he recalls, and they were talking about a soccer game while watching the security camera footage. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for a brief moment of cold that startled them both. It was as if an extremely cold breeze suddenly blew from a refrigerator into the control room. They turned toward the door just to make sure it was closed, and it was. After a few seconds, they confirmed with each other that they hadn't imagined such a thing, but they didn't think much of it either. They laughed about it, joking about ghosts and things like that, and went back to their previous topic while glancing at each screen. Little by little, midnight arrived, and the guards began communicating over the radio, asking for the doors of each cell block to be opened. Seconds later, they saw their companions slowly making their way through the long cell corridors, shining flashlights inside the cells to confirm that each inmate was in their bed that night. A young man named Orlando, who had replaced Hector, was doing his usual rounds in cell block B, and nothing seemed amiss that night. My dad saw him walk down the corridor and onto the second floor, then radioed him to open the door. About 5 minutes passed, and as I said, the job got boring after midnight, since nothing usually happened. But that night, at around 12:10, something caught my dad's attention. A security guard was walking very slowly through cell block B without shining his light into the cells. For a moment his memory failed him, and he wondered if maybe it was Orlando, who was still inside the cell block. But no, he had opened the door for him, he was sure of it. Just to confirm, he picked up his radio and asked, "Orlando, are you still inside cell block B? Did you stay inside when I opened the door for you? Or what?" There were a few long seconds of silence until the radio crackled to life again, with Orlando's voice answering on the other end. "What are you talking about, Carlos? Of course I left. Why would I stay locked up in the cell block?" At that moment, my dad became very tense because that meant there was someone unauthorized walking outside a cell, and he had seen him, at least, until he disappeared into a blind spot on the camera. He touched Octavio's shoulder so he could see him, but he barely noticed any movement. "What was that? Is someone outside his cell?" he asked, but my dad shook his head. He tried to see him through another camera in the same cell block. He wasn't in uniform, he couldn't be an inmate. And although he tried to contact all the guards, there was no way. None of them admitted to being the one walking around cell block B, but they weren't laughing either. They were serious, and immediately 6 of them rushed into cell block B to make sure there wasn't an escape in progress. My dad and Octavio, on the other hand, couldn't understand how it was possible that they hadn't seen anyone on the cameras, and they were hoping that when their colleagues arrived, they would see someone hiding in a blind spot, but they didn't find anyone. They would have liked to analyze the video, but they didn't have access to it. They had to tell the warden that someone had broken into the cell block. And there was a lot of uncertainty because they didn't know what would happen in the morning. But when the sun came up and the head count was done, no inmate was missing. Nobody could explain what had happened, and they preferred to remain silent until it happened a second time. And the last time. About 15 days had passed since then, and as usual, Octavio and my father were working in the control room. It was already 1 a.m., and the head count had been done quite a while ago. They were talking about soccer again when, out of the corner of his eye, my dad saw that security guard walking through Pavilion B. This time he didn't wait, and immediately pulled Octavio from his chair to go see what he was seeing. Octavio remained silent and squinted. A second later, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was Hector. Understand that the cameras back then didn't have great resolution, and when they switched to night mode, they got even worse. But when my dad got a good look, his stomach clenched when he recognized his friend, walking slowly down the corridor he had been in charge of watching for years. He disappeared again when he reached the camera's blind spot, but this time they didn't warn anyone. Octavio and my dad came face to face. They were astonished and decided to keep the secret between the two of them and the guards. The bosses didn't have any, and surely didn't want to hear anything about ghost stories. For weeks and months afterward, they waited patiently for that apparition to repeat itself, but it never did. My dad assumes that in this particular case, Hector was saying goodbye in some way, not only to them when they felt that cold breeze, but also to the place where he worked. I believe it too, because at the end of the day, even though prisons aren't pleasant places to work, people leave their energy and time there, and I suppose it's inevitable to develop some affection for it. I just hope that Mr. Hector has found the light and that his soul has left the walls of that prison.